Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone, the alternate history podcast. It's Dylan once again in the host chair, and today I have two fine gentlemen for a ride along in the What If machine, in no particular order because everybody's vertical on my screen. So I'm going to introduce everybody. First off, we've got Evan Buck.
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
And of course, it would not be a Fork in Time episode recording without a very distinguished gentleman. Chris, do you have any fine words for the people at home?
Hi, good people.
Every time it gets longer, I swear, before too long, we're just going to have a podcast recording that is just us waiting on Chris to say hello, and then it's going to cold end right there.
That's the April Fool's podcast next year. That's what we're doing. Telling you that right now.
I'm all for it.
Mark your calendars, everyone. It's going to be our longest podcast with the least amount of content.
Hey, there you go.
Today, we're exploring a idea that Helena Nash in our Discord gave to us, and it's something that I've always been kind of interested in, not necessarily from an alternate history standpoint, but just from a kind of historical perspective, is these kind of exploration expeditions of the 18th century. There's a good book about Ernest Shackleton's adventure to the South Pole and kind of all of that stuff in the early 1900s. And one of the most famous disaster expeditions of the 1800s is the Lost Franklin expedition, where Captain John Franklin took an expedition of the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror to try and chart the Northwest Passage north of Canada as an alternate route to the Pacific. So in the early 1800s, you know, there's no Panama Canal yet. The only real ways that you can get from the UK and from continental Europe to the Pacific are you can go across the Atlantic and around South America through, around Tierra del Fuego and the Drake Passage, or you can go around the Cape of Good Hope and go the route Magellan took around Africa. Either way, not the most convenient thing in the world because you have to circumvent at least two continents to get to Southeast Asia, China, the Pacific, and all that. So the British are constantly trying to figure out, and the French too, to some extent, a way to get around the northern edge of Canada to try and find a shorter route to the Pacific as they've started to get colonial ambitions out there. So that leads the British, they've had several expeditions before trying to kind of make inroads into the Canadian sort of Arctic, but this is probably the most famous one because of how disastrously it ends. In 1845, John Franklin, kind of a somewhat seasoned, although not entirely successful, British Arctic explorer, leads an expedition of these two ships, goes into the Canadian Arctic, and at some point, a lot of this is reconstructed from archaeology, so we don't know entirely what happened. But at some point, kind of in 1846 or 1847, the ships get trapped in the ice. They're essentially trapped, they're locked. And the problem with that is the ice kind of forces these ships to drift uncontrollably as the ice moves, but the ships can't go anywhere. And eventually the survivors, because at this point people have started dying from malnutrition, from disease, from hypothermia, the survivors start leaving the ships and they try and essentially make a mad, not quite dash, given all the junk they have to haul with them, to the Canadian mainland to try and survive. Because if they stay on the ice,
it's a Hail Mary attempt on their part, and because of everything they're encumbered with, and their own malnutrition. I think if I remember correctly, I read up they were only able to travel like 10 miles a day or 15 miles a day, something like that.
I think it was even less than that towards the end. I know some of the later statistics as they got kind of towards the end, once it was really hitting, was like a mile and a half.
Yeah.
Because this is a naval expedition. They don't have really good equipment. It's not an overland expedition. So these guys are just trudging across ice and rocky islands, half starved, half crazy, trying to get here. And what essentially happens is everyone dies. There's rumors that some guys survive and get onto the mainland and live for another 10 years in the wilderness, but basically nobody makes it back to Britain. Franklin's expedition ends in a complete disaster. And it's ironic because the search for the Franklin expedition actually ends up doing more for the Northwest Passage exploration effort than the Franklin expedition was going to do, because across these 7 or 8 different 1800s and 19th century exploration missions to try and rescue these guys, they map most of the rest of the Northwest Passage, including they kind of speculate as to the route that Roald Amundsen later takes when he successfully gets through in 1906. So, ironically enough, Franklin does more in death than he did with his actual expedition, but this is kind of the most famous 1800s British naval disaster of the age of exploration. And to kind of set up how we can make this end differently, there's a couple of different possible things that could have gone differently in order to change the fate of the expedition. One, Franklin's choice of route was kind of interesting. His sort of planned route actually took him on the western side, towards Hudson Bay side of what's called King William Island. It's kind of right southwest of Baffin Island as you start getting into Canadian Nunavut Arctic territory. The problem with the western side is that in the summers, that's your main traveling season, when you've got to get in and kind of get maneuvered before the ice closes in. The western side of King William Island regularly stays somewhat frozen in the summer. There's a lot of ice that still has to be navigated, whereas if he had gone on the eastern side, where some of the earlier expeditions had kind of somewhat explored and sailed around, that is regularly clear of ice in the summer, especially at this time. Like, it's much easier sailing territory. So that contributed to Franklin's ships originally getting caught in the ice. You also have the choice of Franklin as the expedition commander. Franklin, like I said, he was a somewhat experienced Arctic commander, but he had not been completely successful. He had actually served at the Battle of Trafalgar during the Napoleonic Wars under Nelson. So that was kind of his initial claim to fame. Then he led some overland Arctic expeditions to kind of map the Canadian coast from Hudson Bay. Those didn't end super great. He never really succeeded entirely, and there were some accusations of cannibalism and a murder on one of them. So didn't have the greatest record to begin with. Then he completely does a political U-turn and goes and becomes the lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land, which is in Tasmania. So he goes from the Canadian Arctic all the way to the opposite side of the globe, south of Australia. That ends in scandal. And so by the time 1845 is kicking around, when he's taking this voyage, he is he's 59 years old. He's probably too old to be leading an Arctic expedition. He's right on the cusp. He is not the first choice for this expedition. He is not the second choice for this expedition. He is not the third choice for this expedition. He only gets it because the 3 guys in front of him were either declined it or were deemed for other reasons not suitable. And Franklin was straight up begging for it. At one point, he went to the Lord of the Admiralty when he's trying to get this position and straight up says something to the effect of, well, if it goes wrong, it's not like it can ruin my career more. And the Admiralty was kind of like, he's not wrong.
You got a point there.
You have a point. So William Parry, Parry, not to be confused with Commodore William Parry, who opens Japan for the Americans later.
Who we may or may not talk about later in this episode.
Yeah, who may come up, which is why I made that note. William Parry was the first choice. He's just straight up tired of the Arctic. He's like, no, I hate cold. I'm done. I'm not doing it. James Clark Ross was the number 2 choice. He had just gotten married and had promised his wife that he wasn't going to do any more polar exploration. James Fitzjames was the third choice. He actually captained one of the ships. He captained the HMS Erebus on this expedition, but he was so young. I think he was in his early 30s or even late 20s. They just thought he was too young to captain the entire expedition. Just to give people an idea of who I'm talking about, if you've watched the Hulu kind of horror miniseries, The Terror, Kieran Hines plays John Franklin, and the younger Harris. Richard Harris is the older one. Charles Harris is the younger one, the one from Mad Men. That guy, he plays Fitzjames. So just to give you a visual of who I'm talking about, those people that watch TV, these are the people we're talking about. But Franklin ends up getting it. So you've got some other options for a choice of command that could affect the expedition. And then probably, I think the most realistic one that would lead to a significant change is the sort of provisioning situation. Part of the reason that this expedition had problems is because of all these problems finding a commander, they couldn't finalize the orders for the expedition. That ends up basically leading to they only have 7 weeks before the expedition starts to supply all of the cans of food. They have 8,000 cans that the contractor has to get in 7 weeks. And this is kind of early industrialization. So this is all basically by hand. So the contractor has to get 8,000 cans of food. These are tin cans, but they solder them with lead. So because, 8,000 cans, it's like 1,100 cans a week by hand that he's got to make. He is essentially hot glue gunning this lead solder into these cans. It's just glooping down the sides. So there's a significant amount of lead exposure to the food that's in these cans. But more significantly, the Terror and the Erebus, the two ships, they had been to the Arctic before. They're wood sailing ships, but they've had some Arctic experience. They're kind of trusted ships in this sort of thing. Because this is an unknown expedition, they strengthen the sides of the ships with iron and steel plating to keep the ice at bay to help reinforce the ship. They put extra beams in there so that the ice doesn't crush the ship, because that's one of the things that ruins these expeditions. As the ships get further into the ice, they have to navigate these really narrow channels, and the ice pressure from these giant icebergs and things will literally crush the ship. But they also have a couple of corkscrew propellers that they put on these sailing ships. And those corkscrew propellers are powered by a diesel engine that needs, I think, 1,000 gallons a day of fresh water. Plus, the crew needs fresh water. So they have a desalinator. Basically, they can take seawater, run it through this desalinator, and use it to give fresh water to the men and fresh water for this diesel engine so that it stays cool, so that it can actually function. A lot of the modern archaeology thinks that this desalinator, with its lead piping and some of its lead tooling, is actually what led to most of the lead poisoning that probably significantly contributed to kind of the mental instability that contributed to the downfall of this expedition. So I think, for one thing, we can certainly imagine if perhaps they had settled on a choice, even if it's John Franklin, earlier, they might have had more time to sort of quality control these provisions, especially these lead cans, and maybe work on the desalinator and some of this other stuff with a little bit more time to think about, hey, maybe a little bit less lead would go a long way. But also, I think if Franklin chooses the eastern side of the island, that gets him a little bit further in the expedition so that they can have a chance of getting through. So I think that basically is those are the choices of our fork. I think Franklin's still going to lead the expedition, but say he chooses to go the eastern side of the island, and for whatever reason, the Admiralty picks Franklin earlier, giving them more time to prepare. So that sets up kind of an easier expedition for these guys. So now that I've kind of set up all the gist of kind of how this might go a completely different direction and actually these guys get through, I think assuming that Franklin's expedition is successful and he does manage to find a safe route through the Northwest Passage in probably 46, maybe 47 by the time he gets out the other side, I guess, since we're talking about an exploration mission, what are the most immediate impacts in terms of just cartography, British understanding of the world, technology, things like that?
So I think, when I was thinking through this in the lead up to this recording, I was thinking about and trying to kind of compare, in terms of the technology aspect, where would, steam ship technology, steam icebreakers, all of those sorts of things. Because, again, just as a reminder, these ships are what we would probably call your traditional sailing ships. You think of like Christopher Columbus in 1492 and, sailing the ocean blue. Of course, we're now in the, 19th century, so we're dealing with, more advanced technology, but it's still fundamentally the same basic concept. Your typical sailing ships. We don't really have these, what we would think of as, steamships are on the scene to a certain extent. We have like the mail boats in the Mississippi and those sorts of things, but not what we would call, actual bona fide icebreakers. And so we're kind of dealing with, retrofitting ships that were made for, other kind of purposes. And as Dylan, excellently pointed out in his description, the diesel powered, corkscrew sort of thing, that was really, the main things that we had going on. So in my research during, the lead up to this, I was trying to figure out when the actual first like really successful steamships came around. And from what I can tell, like the first modern icebreaker was built right around the turn of the 20th century by the Russians, if I remember correctly. And there were some like, flirtations. There were some other sort of ice-breaking vessels in, the 60s, 70s time frame. So what I would like, and I kind of have two different ways that this could go. On the one hand, if we have a successful Northwestern Passage establishment made from the Franklin expedition, which is, late 30s, early 40s time frame, I could see this leading to an acceleration of this kind of ice-breaking technology, more wider adoption and, finessing, perfecting of the formula. We could see this sort of technology being perfected maybe, 10, 15, 20 years earlier, possibly, because there would be, this motivation and this ability for people now that we understand, okay, we have this, with imperfect technology, we were able to forge this path to Asia. Now we can kind of start really getting that going. But on the other side, I can also see a tact taken where it's like, okay, well, we were able to make do, with the Eastern Side route and with the technology that we have available to us. So in a sense, I wouldn't say it would necessarily maybe like slow down development in terms of compared to our timeline, but I could see it actually being a little bit of a reason to kind of just keep things steady as she goes, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the diesel engine and the reinforcement side of things, I think you would start to see kind of retrofitting be more prominent, just because now that they have this route that almost necessitates kind of steel reinforcement, corkscrew engines. You see this kind of weird, like I think icebreakers as a concept would be a little bit earlier, because obviously as you put more attention to that, you just go that way a little easier. I almost think you might see kind of proto ironclad kind of ships, at least in some capacity, a little earlier. Not in Arctic exploration, but in other areas, because once you have this technology for reinforcing wooden ships for Arctic exploration, you can translate that to ships of war, ships in sort of dodgier maritime areas.
Or almost inverse the development in our timeline, where you're taking wooden ships and putting the iron on top to deflect bullets. In this time, you're just putting it in the bottom to deflect ice, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that, especially for the British and the Russians, because the reasons the Russians invented the icebreaker is because they have the most coastline that has to worry about ice. So I think
most of Russian history can be boiled down to one thing, and that is their eternal search for a warm water port.
Pretty much.
So up until that point, you need to kind of make do with what you got, and that is why they developed this ice-breaking technology.
Yeah, and so I think especially the British and the Russians will really kind of take to this polarization in a scientific sense, not a political sense of the word, of their sort of like exploration fleets. for this. I also think because of the nature of exploration, you'll see some developments of canning and sort of long-term provisions a little earlier. So, kind of World War I is famously one of the first conflicts where tin cans really kind of are a thing because you have so many troops that you need to feed and be able to store so many supplies. So I wonder if you'll start seeing tin cans kind of, one, be better because they have more time to develop them, and two, kind of earlier prominence in some other conflicts, which that gets to these kind of abstract concepts of, supply and war and things like that. I think those are probably the other than the fact of, oh, hey, we can sail around Canada now relatively easily. I think those are kind of the big technological aspects that a successful Franklin voyage would probably do. And maybe they would understand lead poisoning a little more because these guys would still have some kind of problems. So you think that they would maybe study some of the expedition veterans, especially the doctors that would look at them after the fact. I don't know that they would magically figure out that lead poisoning is a problem, but they might at least have some inklings that it's a concern for some of these guys. Those are at least my thoughts on kind of scientifically where this would kind of lead to.
Yeah, and something that I thought of as a possibility as well is that, as you mentioned in the lead up discussion, a lot of the advancements that we got from this expedition are precisely because it failed. And we had to go in, we meaning, collectively as those who were trying to figure out what happened, the British in this case, sent in their teams to figure out what happened. And so as a result, they were able to kind of take their time to actually look around their surroundings and be like, okay, where exactly did these people go? And they're trying to reverse engineer the routes because we didn't exactly know where they went. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have, all of that going on. And so they're going step by step. They're doing all the mapping. They're doing the cartography. They're doing the, all of those from a like research standpoint and a, not so much a rescue mission standpoint, but a recovery mission standpoint. I do think that although we would see technological advancements, a little bit faster in our timeline, something that I think might be a consequence of this being a success is that the scientific endeavor, I think, would be something that's more of a, I'm not going to necessarily say back burner kind of issue, but it's more something that will happen as the shipping routes get established, as the geopolitical implications set in. So rather than having the scientific research and the science be the primary focus, it's just going to be a side benefit. Like basically you're going to have the Royal Navy, taking notes along the way as they're just full steam ahead through the Northwest Passage. And that could have a very interesting impact, I feel, on the development of these technologies, because a lot of technologies that we see today, like from NASA, for example, a lot of them happened because they were things that we just accidentally discovered along the way. And a lot of them were like early military sort of uses as well. And so I think that would kind of be how a lot of these discoveries would take place. It would be much more so a side benefit as opposed to the primary focus. And some of our listeners might be, well, how does that really necessarily change things? I think that does change quite a few things. And we'll probably get into this a little more when we talk about, the geopolitical implications of a open Northwest Passage. But before we get into that, I also wanted to throw in another name as well, because the person who did actually successfully first get through the Northwest Passage was someone who Dylan name dropped, Amundsen. And his career is, pretty impacted by his ability to discover the Northwest Passage. And I want to say it was in like 1901, 1903 timeframe when he did this. So, a good 50, 60 years after the time frame we're talking about here. And just on my quick research before we hopped on the episode, Amundsen, despite how successful he was, had somewhat of a hard time, like actually getting governments on board to fund him. The Norwegian government wasn't necessarily super, on board with the amount of money he was asking for. So if we have a earlier discovery of the Northwest Passage by the British and not by a Norwegian, 50 years later, I'm just curious how this would possibly impact his career because, and Dylan or Chris, you probably know this more than I do. When was the, because I think he did work in the South Pole as well, didn't he?
Yeah, Amundsen, yeah, he and Shackleton kind of went back and forth after Scott's infamous disaster to the South Pole. So Amundsen actually beat Shackleton to reaching the South Pole.
They were part of the famous race to the South Pole.
Yeah. So Amundsen basically does, I think, the Northwest Passage, and then immediately within a year or two turns around and does the South Pole.
So this catapults Amundsen to be able to get to that successful race for the South Pole. So what if, as a ripple effect of this, alternate timeline, we instead have who is the name of the other explorer?
So you've Shackleton? Got so Franklin is this Shackleton? Expedition. Yeah, Shackleton is the British guy who tries to go to the South Pole. Infamously, as World War I is kicking off, he has his disaster, gets rescued. He leaves in like 1914 as war is starting. He gets picked up in late 1917 or 1918, and he goes, "Oh, how'd the war go?" And they're like, "What do you mean, how'd it go? It's still going." And he's like,
What? Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of interesting to think through that because we would still have Amundsen, of course, but he wouldn't be focused on the Northwest Passage anymore. So this might actually cause him to focus more of his energies on the South Pole.
Yeah.
And have him be even faster and more successful.
Yeah. Or he might try to go straight north because there's this interesting, and this is kind of an aside, but since it's come up, I'll talk about it. Some of these Arctic explorers had this theory that, they knew that the Arctic was a thing, that it was full of ice, but they had this theory that if you could get through the ice, you could essentially sail straight over the middle of the North Pole. It was like this ring of ice and mountains, and there was just a complete placid ocean in the middle. So if you could somehow unlock that, you could shoot to, from the North Pole, any point south on the globe if you could just figure out how to get through the ice. So maybe Amundsen tries to do that.
That would actually be really interesting. And and once and for all, sorry for any children who are somehow listening to this podcast, but once and for all prove that Santa is not real.
And that there are no lizard people at the middle of the hollow earth.
Very true. Very true. Sorry for our conspiracy theorists who are listening in.
Especially those in Wyoming.
Yes. Especially those from Wyoming. Yes.
I don't know the place of which you speak.
Hey, that t-shirt that I wear has fomented several conversations with my friend group, and I have been busy spreading the truth of Wyoming not existing.
Yeah. So I think there are some interesting scientific and exploratory knock-on effects, but I think, Evan, you kind of brought it up, so I guess we can go to it. I think the big, to sort of wheel back to the whole reason why this expedition is a thing, I think the biggest effects are going to be geopolitical, because now the British, if this expedition succeeds, they're going to have a straight shot to the Pacific that's navigable. They don't have to get around multiple continents. They don't have to daisy chain between, ports on, at the African coast and the South American coast to kind of bounce and hop to get to the Pacific. They can just go north of Canada, which is a British territory, at least the eastern part. The western part's kind of still getting settled, but that opens up a whole world of possibilities for what can happen from 1850 onward, which those of you who know sort of Victorian era history might know is rife with opportunity if you have an easy access from continental Europe to the Pacific. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to our foreign policy expert, Chris, to start us off, because we've got a bunch of things that we could talk about, but I want to see where Chris goes first.
I would appreciate his guiding hand on this.
Yeah. The first thing that went through my mind was this, right? Great Britain and the controllers of Alaska go to war not long after this expedition happens. Like, it initially I was kind of, well, is this, is kind of the Yukon border going to be another front in the Great Game? And then I looked at the actual dates and no, hold on. No, they're actually fighting each other already. And basically the what I'm talking about is something that we probably know as the Crimean War around, 1855, 54, 56. Russia rushes, and tries to take over the Dardanelles Straits again. That leads to basically Britain and France joining Turkey in a war, except if you kind of look at a map, they have to decide where are we actually going to fight the Russians, because we don't really border them a whole lot. And it's known as the Crimean War to us because that's where they decided to actually really fight them. If we have a Northwest Passage, one of the other minor fronts probably becomes a lot more important. And I'm going to encourage everybody to pull over to the side of the road if you're commuting and pull up Google Maps, because that really helps this. But basically, there's this place called the Kamchatka Peninsula, which, if you're envisioning a map, it's the part of Russia that kind of sticks down. Imagine if you don't know where Japan is, it looks like a finger pointing down and telling you, here is Japan, coming off of Siberia.
Yep.
That's the best way to describe it. The British actually did try and take over that peninsula. They landed and tried to take out the major base there. That becomes a lot more important if this is a potential stepping stone to Asia. And I think that might even become not just, the Kamchatka Peninsula, but Alaska's right there.
Mm-hmm.
I think Alaska becomes a lot more important in the Russian mindset, because think of what happened in our own timeline. Alaska was seen as, kind of this, outpost, icebox, nothing really valuable there. I mean, why were we meaning the Americans, were able to purchase it for $7.2 million in 1867, and everybody basically took a dump on Seward for doing so, because nobody thought there was anything worthwhile there in the slightest. I am going to give a callback to an episode that we did a while ago about, what would have happened if Russia had held on to Alaska. I forget what number it was, but it was a really interesting episode. And I think that, as opposed to what happened in that timeline where the Russians just kind of held on to it because they saw it as a convenient way, as like Siberia 2.0 Electric Boogaloo, they're able to send people, and eventually a younger brother, we're doing callbacks to the Little Brothers Club, to go and Chris is just shaking his head right now, like, I swear to God.
I am standing up for our listeners. I am going in all of our discussions. That was a great time in our lives.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Best of times and the worst of times.
We are putting that to bed. Okay. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it's in the past.
It's in the past. We had our fun. We got that out of our system, but we'll go back to our regularly scheduled programming. But now Alaska is, and you pull up a map, you go to even just literally the Wikipedia page on the Northwest Passage, and you see that there is a massive chunk of a lot of the different routes around the Northwest Passage that pretty much encircle Alaska. So from a geopolitical standpoint, Alaska is now hugely important to the Russians to hold on to and to fortify. So if you have more warfare in the Kamchatka Peninsula and possible, attacks or forays or expeditions into Alaska, we're opening up another front in this war, which in our timeline ends in a pretty resounding defeat for the Russians, which is also probably partly why they ended up selling Alaska, is because they needed money. But I digress. So now we have this other front opened up in a war that that the Russians lost, pretty big time in our timeline. I don't really necessarily see that diverting enough resources to change the outcome of the war. But do we see this potentially resulting in a British Alaska? I don't think so.
I can see them maybe doing like taking some kind of port that's on the Alaskan border, just because they're going to want some supply port, but they're not going to make a claim on the whole territory.
I think they are.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, just because. Listen,
they don't have they don't even have the western part of Canada settled, so maybe they could take this as a opportunity to firm up that claim.
I mean,
or it's so sparsely settled that it's kind of just one of the throw-ins in whatever the real negotiation is.
Exactly. That could be.
Like it doesn't divert a lot of the land resources, but this provides an opportunity to use the British Navy, which they,
are famous for having a good one.
And also, like, that's their strength.
Yeah.
And they can just, Russia would really like to hold, and I understand what you're saying, they might like to hold this. And by the way, they probably this might spur some Russian development in their Far East to allow them to threaten some of these communications, some of these trade routes coming through the Bering Straits. But like, Russia got whooped in Crimea.
Yeah, they're just going to be praying to God they have an East Coast.
And they they don't have enough, they don't have anything really in Alaska.
No.
And Britain kind of just says, nope, I'm taking this.
Yeah. Well, and they probably not just take Alaska, but they would probably, because the British have already an interest in the Far East, but now they have a more direct route to get there. So they're going to be very much interested in strengthening their position. They may take even some of those, like, Alaska has the Aleutian Islands that kind of stretch, to use a Sarah Palin quote, basically to where you can see Russia from your backyard.
You can see Russia from your backyard. Yep.
And that chain from Kamchatka all the way down, like that chain from the Kamchatka Peninsula, those islands stretch all the way to northern Japan. So I can very much see some of those islands.
I think Russia does still have an East Coast.
Yeah.
I don't think the
British are going to want that much of it.
Right.
No.
And
I think they're going to take a China approach, honestly, because we talked about this in the pre-podcast as well, where a lot of what ended up happening in our timeline with the British and all of these Europeans getting a mad dash for influence in, the Far East is because there is no, sea route really, or convenient sea route. So why keep having to, send a bunch of stuff all the time with no established base of operations? At least have something, going on for you. We got the first, the Opium Wars as a big part of what happened here as a result of that. So, do the British even necessarily want to take over the entire Alaskan territory, the entire Kamchatka Peninsula? I mean, they might take the Aleutian Islands, in my view.
I think the British take Alaska. One, there is nothing in internal Alaska. Like if the British were to actually take,
they don't even find gold yet at this point.
Right.
Now, gold isn't even until later on.
Yeah, like if the British honestly take Juneau and Anchorage and the Aleutians,
they have Alaska.
They got Alaska. Anything else there.
Yeah.
And also, I don't think the British are stupid enough to allow the Russians any claim to anything else once you have them off the American continent. Just take all.
Yeah.
Like, there's no reason not to.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I think they take some of those islands. I don't think they take any treaty concessions on the mainland, just kind of because of what I was saying earlier, which is like, to echo what Dylan said, the British have a navy. Navy is what the British do. And if a small island off the coast can serve your purpose, you take that because you can it's so much easier as the British to hold like a small island versus to actually like take a city and not have anything in the hinterlands.
Yeah. And I think if the British, take, Alaska, because basically all it is like Chris said, 3 towns and, 500 square miles of God knows who cares what. If they take some of the I think it's the Kuril Islands, that puts them in a natural position.
Everybody, the Kuril, just to kind of, pull over again, pull up Google Maps again. The Kuriles are kind of just a chain of islands that lead from the finger pointing towards northern Japan, just kind of trickle down up until the Japanese home islands.
Yeah, they're like the Aleutians between Kamchatka and Japan,
right?
Basically,
pretty much.
But if they take some of those, that then gives them a sort of natural naval staging area to go one towards China that they just finished fighting an opium war with. So they're already firmly pointed that direction. And the British are also well into India at this point. So they now essentially have a link of things that wrap. Now the empire truly never sees the sunset because they have effectively enough land everywhere that there is literally always, no matter what time zone you're in.
Let's be perfectly honest. Let's assume they set up one base on the northern part of Alaska just as a stopover. 6 months out of the year, that one town the sun never sets on.
Exactly. So they're
pretty much. Yeah, they're good to go.
But that puts them within easy striking range of China for the inevitable second and third and however many more opium wars. But say this ends in, when does the Crimea end in our timeline? Like 1853?
No, I want to say more like 56.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 53 to 56.
Okay, so that puts them kind of right in the timeline of, so the Americans opened Japan in 54. It's Commodore Perry. But if the British have something in the Kuril Islands, one, who's to say while they have gunboats in the area during the war, they don't go and do it.
But and actually, I think we did an episode on this.
We did an episode on Commodore
Perry. Yeah, you
Perry.
did a Perry episode, yeah.
Yeah,
where,
we did.
Hey, by the way, I think we talked about like the gunboats that were in the area. That's kind of why the Americans did it.
Well, I was going to say...
The Americans were able to do it because
the
British were involved in the war.
So here's and this is kind of something that I'm thinking about as well. I'm kind of thinking of two different implications of this. First of all, like with America, we had the whole, Monroe Doctrine. We have all of this sort of thing of not wanting European involvement on the North American continent. We've been trying to shoo them off for a while. Around this time frame, we have, Manifest Destiny, James K. Polk, all this going on. This is more like in the mid to late 40s. But the Oregon dispute, the Oregon territory, that gets all hashed out. That gets settled,
That's like 1848, I think.
46, 48, somewhere around there. So, and so just thinking of time frame and timing and all of this, like that boundary is still, still gets settled. Everything there happens the same way. But now all of a sudden we have the British encompassing the entire northern third, if not half, I guess, depending on how you look at it geographically, of the North American continent and the Kuril Islands. I think this, if we already in our timeline had a fire lit under our butts as Americans to go and try and open up Japan, I think we have now. I think the Americans are now much more, keenly interested in and invested in this possible, British problem of being super entrenched in North America. And they also want to open up. I think this would even further incentivize opening up Japan to the West.
See, I think it might. First, I think the whole Monroe Doctrine was kind of a combined U.S.-British idea. It was much more focused like South. And once the U.S. kind of gives up, like
because Canada was part of the British Commonwealth. Well,
Right.
they're still part of the British Commonwealth, but if I'm remembering my whole, I didn't study Canadian history in high school because I'm an American, but for my notes in just kind of keeping track of things, and I was thinking of the geopolitics of this. We had, the rebellions of 1837 in Canada. We have the Act of Union in 1840, which basically just throws all of what is considered Canada into one giant soup pot and calls it a day. And then we have a lot of migration.
Any fan of old school Hearts of Iron knows that's wrong. Administratively, they kept Newfoundland separate.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't know that. It's good that I have
my hundreds of hours of Hearts of Iron can confirm that's what the map looks like.
Okay, good. Very good to know. But we also have the Great Migrations, happening from, basically peopling this, these massive territories, that are here in North America. So since we have, the Monroe Doctrine kind of being more of a, no European influence, the British are cool. They're okay. We beat them in 2 wars, and as long as they stay in the polar icebox north of our border, we're cool. We're chill.
Like the whole Monroe Doctrine is British or more so European powers can't extend their influence at the expense of American republics, American states.
Yeah.
You can't really extend that argument to kicking the Russians out of America.
Well,
no, because that was not my understanding was we, on the basis of the Monroe Doctrine, were never really super concerned about, Russian Alaska. We had our own reasons why we wanted to buy, Alaska from the Russians. And frankly, the Russians were never, it was almost like, the Spanish missions, in California, like extremely limited development and, establishing of maybe trading, hunting, fur trapping outposts kind of thing.
Well, so here's an idea. And this gets to kind of talking about the British and Canada versus the Americans vis-a-vis Canada, or vis-a-vis Alaska specifically. So we talked about, in our timeline, 1848-ish, the Oregon question is kind of settled. That's assuming that Russia still owns Alaska, because it's not a British,
because
I think in our timeline it still happens that way.
Because the change doesn't happen for another 5-6 years.
But that's where I'm going.
Okay.
So the Oregon question is settled before in this timeline, the British have control of Alaska, where there has already been gold discovered, even if it doesn't necessarily start getting mined for, another decade or two. The reason why I'm going there is California was Spanish, but there was gold there, and Americans didn't really give a whole lot of concern over the fact that it was Spanish. They just started moving out there. So I wonder if, and the American Civil War throws a wrench in kind of this timing, but I wonder if at some point, regardless of whether the question of 1848 Oregon has quote unquote been settled, if there is gold in Alaska and it is now British / Canadian / depending on your American political perspective in the 18th century, rightfully American, I can see the Americans at some point potentially reopening the question of 1848 if they want to start getting to Alaska. This is more like 1870s, once in our timeline Seward's Folly was realized not to be a mistake. But I can sort of see Americans trying to forcibly revisit that at some point.
Just because how deep in what is Alaska, how deep in Canada this is.
Okay.
We don't have a problem claiming California from the Mexicans.
Yeah.
We don't have a problem claiming the Black Hills from the Sioux. When it comes to reaching that far into Canada and claiming that from the world's preeminent empire,
yeah,
that's a
Yeah.
We might. Why don't we just go ahead and claim Rhodesia too? Like that's how much sense it makes.
I think Dylan, the point that because I kind of think Chris has a very compelling argument there, but I think Dylan, to the point that I think you're making, I think it could help to foster a renegotiation of, business terms, probably.
Yeah. Okay.
Like on an economic level, I think the Americans are probably going to be, and this was kind of where I was seeing this going in my mind as well, is this could lead to, a deepening of this relationship, between the Americans and the British.
Yeah.
And
well, maybe there's a bunch of Americans that move up to Alaska and they, like how BC is super settled compared to the interior of Canada and sort of like Manitoba and, some of the other interior provinces. Maybe, Juneau and, Anchorage, like there's a whole strip of super settled Canadian BC and Alaska. Maybe that's how it goes. I don't know. Maybe.
Now, the one thing I'm going to kind of pause and take this, another place that we touched a little bit. I think this really affects Japan.
Yes, that's where I was wanting to go to next.
Because in our timeline, in our kind of sense of this, Japan is a northern extremity. It's not really paid attention to. And we are, depending on where in this timeline we're talking, we're 10, 15 years from Tom Cruise coming in and restoring the Emperor.
There's more than one samurai at this point, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Well, I just feel like when you look at the Europeans in Asia, Japan's an afterthought, and it's very lucky to be an afterthought.
Yeah.
Because
I mean, look at what happened to China.
It's allowed to kind of like have its own period where Europeans aren't really messing with them, and then undertake development. I don't think that happens here. I think Japan, and so that's a big change as well.
So Chris, do you think this is going to possibly cause like a stronger reaction of concern amongst, the Japanese at this point? Because the factors that led to them opening up in our timeline were essentially, we come in with our gunboats and say, all right, we're asking nicely, but the implications are very clear. We're projecting our soft and hard power a little bit. And the Japanese kind of realize the writing's on the wall. If they don't, really acquiesce, either they're not going to be able to maintain their, way of life for much longer. So this is what leads to their, westernization. In this timeline, are you saying that we're going to be seeing like maybe more of a forcefully anti-Western reaction?
Well, what I'm saying is, frankly, I think their agency is taken away from them.
Yeah, that's
what I think so too.
You have, what you're talking about is if you look at this, like Perry opens Japan in 54. 14 years later, the Meiji Restoration starts, and that is a result of this. A result of it's a little similar to what's going on in Russia. Why they need to sell it, because they realize how far behind they are, and that we need to upgrade. The thing, 14 years is a long time when it comes to when it comes to the speed of things happening at this time period. And I think it's, when what you transition to is when ships show up in your port, they're not opening your port. They're not telling you to let us trade there. I think this might just be turned into another front in an opium situation.
That's exactly where I'm thinking.
The
British already have treaty ports in China where they're doing this whole opium thing. Japan is not. It's not all that far away, and especially if they're hop, skip, and a jump.
And if you just thinking about the map of this, like if you're the British coming from India through Malaysia, your concentration is through the South China Sea feeding into China.
Yes.
If you're coming a different route, that's very different.
Well, and
very
if you have, whether it happens before the US can get to Japan or whether it happens kind of roughly around the same time, but importantly, separately, the US opening of Japan as the sort of leading edge meant that the opening of Japan had a certain kind of American characteristic where it was
almost
much more
an open door characteristic.
Exactly. The British are not going to be like that. They're going to go in guns
the
blazing.
door is open.
They're going to take territory.
But the door
There's going to
is
be red
kicked
coats
down. The door is kicked down open.
Yes. So Japan is going to feel kind of it's going to have much more of this kind of lost century sort of Chinese philosophy, not necessarily to the Chinese extent, but it's going to have some of those kind of same feelings. Because, you've got to remember the Dutch have been there for a couple hundred years at this point, but they're the Dutch. They're just there to sell guns.
I mean, the Dutch kind of touched there and then got kicked out. They haven't been there for that period of time.
But compared to the Japanese kind of isolationist experience of the Dutch, the Americans are going to kind of force the door open and be like, all right, all we care about is trade. The British are going to say, all we care about is getting whatever we want and you can shove it. So that's going to affect the Japanese mindset vis-a-vis Westerners, I think. It's going to kind of tie in Japan and their sort of Victorian experience much more to China, which is, ironically enough, how most of Japan's history has kind of been. They've very much been tied to China. And it's only in this kind of 18th century and 19th century that they kind of diverged into being sort of different cultural experiences, or at least unrelated cultural experiences. So I think you would see Japan. I almost wonder if there would be some kind of a Japanese civil war between kind of the, whether Meiji would be on the side of the sort of the pro-British, pro-Western side, or the kind of conservative Asianist side.
I think you might actually see a more what I think is maybe the Tom Cruise documentary that we're all talking about becomes a lot more important, because what I could easily see is American support for a single unified Meiji restoration.
Yeah.
But open and overt British support for a shogun period of
shogunates.
You're gonna have one warlord in Hokkaido, you're gonna have one in Kyushu, because we want it split up.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's going to be,
and I mean, it's going to kind of mirror what happened in British Raj India.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it'd be the exact same kind of thing going on.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. That has huge ripple effects, I think, for downstream.
East Asia in general.
East Asia in general. I think that's huge. I think it's also something that I wanted to touch on, and if either of you have something else you wanted to talk about with Asia too, before we hop here, then we can do that as well. But I just want to throw into this mix as well. I think this has, huge implications for the development of the Nicaragua Canal that never happened, or the Panama Canal, because there is now no longer as much of a need. I really hesitate to say that it wouldn't happen, because I mean, let's be real here. We still have Arctic ice frequently being a problem in the Northwest Passage. So technology might be accelerated a little bit, but there is still, I think, going to be a push for, we don't really want to have be a 50-50, 60-40, 75-25 chance that, something goes right versus something goes wrong. So I don't think this is going to necessarily completely 100% preclude the desire for that sort of canal, but I do think it will kind of forestall that for a little bit.
I'm not sure it will, and the reason I'm saying that is this: the United States, the U.S. still wants to be able to get from the Pacific to the Atlantic,
because this is a British controlled area.
Exactly.
And so we will probably still maybe want to have our own hands in the matter.
The thing I think that might change and is really interesting is the other canal that allows this, which is Suez.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Egypt is no longer as important to the British and everything that does.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, I still think
interesting.
I'm just because they're already in the area. I'm sure there's because I think didn't the French actually build the Suez?
Yes, French built the Suez.
Yeah, but I wonder if maybe the Suez kind of goes into not disrepair, but it just has such of a less spotlight on it.
I think what I find interesting is the idea of almost national shipping channel.
Yes.
So, for example,
because the French had their hands. The French had their hands in Panama too.
The French British are the reason why the Panama Canal is not in Nicaragua.
Precisely.
Which is a funny story.
The British are kind of going around Canada. The United States wants Panama. And I think you're right. The French have Indochina. They have their own interest in using some of this. I think Suez actually might stay French.
Yeah, I can kind of see that.
That important to the
British aren't as pressed to use it. Yeah,
exactly. That's interesting. I mean, I could see this possibly leading to because when you look at the whole Nicaraguan Panama Canal issue, Teddy Roosevelt really kind of bully pulpited and pushed pretty hard for the Panama Canal when the Nicaraguan route was seen as much more of a possibility and was much more politically supported, I guess you can say, much more politically popular. So if our perspective is, ours meaning the American perspective, is now slightly different, we think of it as, okay, the British have their area, the French have their area. I mean, do we still see as strong of a push for Panama? Or do we actually see maybe the Americans going, okay, the French can have what they have, the British can have what they have. We'll just go ahead and go for the more, what is seen as expedient, option in the Nicaraguan route. Dylan, you seemed like you were really eager to throw in something there.
Yeah. So, and this is kind of just another possibility. So we've now, we've talked about the Americans, the British, the French. There is one colonial empire left who, at this point, is on the out, but still has territories specifically around all of this stuff that's changing hands.
The Portuguese?
No, the other ones.
The Spanish?
Yes. This is before the Spanish-American War.
Mm-hmm.
So
very true.
The Spanish have already been invaded by Napoleon, which is basically the beginning of the end of the Spanish colonial empire, what's left of it. But they still have Guam, Puerto Rico, and more importantly for this timeline, the Philippines.
And Cuba for our... For a Central American canal.
Yeah, specifically for this, I'm thinking more the Philippines because now you have an easier Pacific playground for the British, to a certain extent the French, because they have the Suez. The Americans are kind of in the neighborhood, but I don't think they're going to care about the Philippines so much as Cuba and the Caribbean. But, the Philippines are basically the Spanish's only territory east of kind of the Middle East. It's the only Pacific territory. So I wonder if, and I have no idea how this would happen, but I wonder if somehow there's some issue between either the Brits or the French and the Spanish that would cause them to lose the Philippines somehow.
I really kind of don't want to open this.
Okay, that's fine.
But I'm going to keep going, and maybe we set up another one.
Let's see where this goes, because I have another possible place this can go, but I want Chris to take this first.
First, in our timeline and in our history, the British are very, very cognizant of protecting the routes. I think the French, between Saigon and Manila, have a strong incentive to try and turn the South China Sea into a French lake. The reason I'm approaching it that way is my constant belief, and Dylan and I have talked about this, and I've talked about it before. I completely discount any of these medieval ideas of claims or whatever. If you want something, you're going to come up with a reason to take it. That's why I'm about to talk about the reason they used to take it, which is the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War. The Franco-Prussian War begins because of a Spanish secession
That's
crisis.
right. Yep.
So I think it's a possibility that the French want the Philippines and allow the claimant of, basically allow their non-preferred claimant on the Spanish throne in exchange for the Philippines.
Okay.
It's losing the battle to win the war.
And the beautiful thing about that is they just change which Philip it's named after. They don't have to do much else.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. I like where that's going. Something else that I'll throw in here as well is, literally while we're talking here, I learned I didn't even know the name of this war and that it existed. I just kind of knew this whole time period as, Americans and the predecessors of the CIA totally, definitely not messing around in Central America at all. Just kidding, they did very heavily. We have a conflict called the Filibuster War in, like the mid 1850s. And that was basically because this guy who wanted to take over Sonora for the United States tried to, pull some shenanigans as well in a little bit further down south once the Sonorans, kicked him out. And I think this is really interesting. Again, kind of going back to what I was saying about Nicaragua.
Mm-hmm.
If we as Americans are now kind of more focused on and see these canals as more regional things, the whole reason why the Central American Alliance won the Filibuster War is because William Walker pretty much only had 60 guys to work with.
But by the way, people, I'm telling you right now, there's a podcast called Behind the Bastards. They did an episode on this guy. Go look this up. It is amazing.
Yeah,
it is amazing what this
I am
guy
just
does.
quickly skimming the Wikipedia on this war and this guy, and I'm like, I want to learn more about this.
Yes.
But like the major reason why this doesn't work so well is because the Americans are really trying to not seem like they're officially supporting it, even though, like there are some people in our government who are like, yeah, you know what? Why don't you try this? Why don't you go for this? John Wheeler, I think was the name, like the minister to Nicaragua. He was like, yeah, you know what? Try it. See what happens. We're not going to stop you. What if there is more of a, early United States mindset of meddling more in the Central American countries? Because we're like, all right, we got to get we got to get skin in the game. We got to get our hands in the cookie jar. We got to have our own controlled route from east to west. That could have led to the Filibuster War being a much bigger conflict than it actually was.
Well, and there's one. So I don't want to keep dragging this episode out too much. This may be
you probably start wrapping it up a little bit.
Yeah,
with a increased British presence in Asia more than they already were. You also have to wonder if things in Hawaii might, or the Sandwich Islands, as the British called them, might have changed for the worse with earlier British involvement. Because Hawaii kind of kicks off 1880s, 1890s. But if the British are around in Japan and more in kind of Southeast Asia, you have to wonder, because at this point they knew that Hawaii was a thing. They just weren't necessarily interested in it. But you wonder if involvement might have kicked up earlier.
I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because in our timeline, kind of in our mental picture of the Pacific, Hawaii is a key stepping stone to Asia.
I think it's too far south in this timeline.
Not in this. It's
kind of out of the way compared for this.
Now, what I think happens, though, if you do have more interest in Asia and more activity out there, you might, and what you probably do have is more, for the lack of a better phrase, Americans Texizing.
I think Texas, Texification.
Yeah.
I think that's a distinct possibility.
And because historically, even with British involvement, even with Hawaiian independence, Grover Cleveland and the United States pushed Hawaii away and are not bringing in the planter state.
Yeah.
I don't think that happens anymore. I think the United States encourages that. And, I love what you're talking about with Walker down in Central America. I think that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of, what I'm seeing is multiple highways to Asia.
Yeah.
A British highway through the north, a French highway, kind of Suez, Indochina, Manila, and a American highway, Nicaragua, Hawaii from there.
Okay.
Ooh, I love that. That's see that. So cool. That's really interesting. All right, gentlemen. Well, I think that's about as good a place as any to leave things up to the listener's interpretation and maybe a possible second part. Anything else that we want to mention? Because there is one thing on my mind, but if there's anything else that you guys want to go for first.
I am hesitant to encourage one more thing just because of how much trouble that has created for us.
I think I know the thing
and in this specific episode, but
I think I know the thing Evan's going to say, so I'm going to let him say it, and then if he doesn't, I'll come back around. But this is just kind of a fun fact thing. So since Evan's going to take the one I think he's going to take, I'll take this one instead. So going all the way back to what started this, to John Franklin, literature fans among you might be fascinated to know that John Franklin's sister was the mother-in-law of a very famous British poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, to the point that, I mentioned at the beginning, Franklin at one point was lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania. There is a square in central Van Diemen's Land called Franklin Square. There's a statue of him. His epitaph on the statue was written by Alfred Lord Tennyson, who is his nephew-in-law, I think is the technical term. So just kind of a fun fact about how Franklin relates to the wider British culture.
And now I know exactly two things written by Alfred Lord Tennyson.
Exactly, yeah. And everybody knows the name. Nobody knows what he wrote other than Ozymandias.
It's really interesting that it's Tennyson because of the other thing he wrote.
Yeah, because it's Ozymandias.
Ozymandias, yeah. And wasn't...
Charge of the Light Brigade?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And wait, wasn't Charge of the Light Brigade about movements in the Crimean War?
It's literally about the Crimean War.
We all come full circle.
Yeah.
We literally all come full circle. Yeah, that's awesome, man. So yeah, Dylan, that's great. That wasn't what I was thinking of. But I'm going to say the thing which I think you're thinking I'm going to say. Hashtag Thinkception. Something that I find interesting in terms of a little piece of trivia of presidential history is that the Resolute desk in the White House was constructed out of cast-off wood that was found during the salvage operations for this expedition. If we do not have these ships, in fact, actually running aground in ice and being broken apart and et cetera, there would be no Resolute desk in the White House. We would not have a lot of those iconic photos of, John F. Kennedy's son, hiding out underneath the desk.
Nicolas Cage wouldn't hit buttons to find the Book of Secrets in the worst of the two National Treasure movies.
Yes, and by the way, I have and I'm gonna show this on the webcam for the benefit of the other co-hosts, but I have, if you can see it,
turn off your blur.
I have to turn off the blur for that. But it's actually a movie poster for the Book of Secrets movie. Because I was really looking forward to that as a kid. It wasn't as great as I was hoping it would be. Definitely one of the worst of the two movies, but it was still an okay time regardless. So that has been hanging on my wall since 2007. So there you go. Another little piece of personal history thrown in there as well. All right, gentlemen. Well, thanks for this very interesting walking through of the possibilities of a successful Franklin expedition. I think now that we've covered and exhausted and squeezed the blood out of this turnip, I think as much as we possibly could, sounds a second episode.
Yeah, second episode, yeah.
I think we are going to stumble across the age-old question that we like to ask at the end of all of our episodes. If we happen across a fork in time, what, pray tell, do you believe we should do with that?
Take it.
Take it. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.